I suppose the idea is just to try and showcase language at its best in whatever form that might take. I mean, I've always had a view of poetry as a very broad church anyway, not just something that exists within the confines of a published book. So, in more recent times, the idea I think is that poetry can encompass spoken word, it can encompass song lyric, because it's not just a poetry festival either. We're just thinking about language operating at its very best in whatever format that might be. So I think the idea is just to try and be inclusive as much as anything, and that extends as well to trying to make a bridge between the university and the city. This is not just an in-house academic university event. It's something that we want the whole city and the whole region to be involved in. I suppose when you think about the word lyric, you tend to think about maybe song lyrics or lyric poetry as being something structured and composed. And we're just trying to get all variations on that one theme. So yeah, it's been a very kind of plural festival, really, and from kind of what you might think of as high art at one end to almost sort of spontaneous spoken word stuff at the other, and that's how it was designed. I think one of the highlights was Linton Kwesi Johnson. I didn't really know what to expect. I've seen him reading a couple of times. Very powerful, very emotive. But it was the passion and the political determination that was apparent in that hall last night. That was apparent in the hall that night, and there was a huge crowd there. And I think maybe some people had come along for nostalgia. They maybe remember Linton reading his poems on the radio or going to festivals 20, even 30 years ago. But I think people were just blown away by the energy and the will of that reading. I remember people wanting to clap between poems, and he would say, "No, wait. This is a man with something to say, something important." And also, he probably isn't somebody who gets studied that much within a university setting. So it just felt like a really significant occasion. Could probably say the same thing about Kate Tempest this year. She's not somebody that we necessarily know through books and publications. A lot of her fame and affirmation has come through word of mouth and through contemporary media, YouTube and social networks. So in some ways it was a bit of a gamble. I didn't know whether people would respond or want to come along, but again the hall was absolutely chock-a-block. And it was a really passionate and emotive night. There was a lot of love in that room that night. I don't think lyric will be more of the same. I tend to feel that all these things have to evolve, or they just become moribund, and then they just end up passing you by and they die. I would really like it to become a competition and a publication, something that we can host here in the department, in the university, but something with national status. I'd like it to develop into that, and I've been thinking in those terms of lyric as a sort of launch pad for that, for the next 7 or 8 years. I think it's also true that myself and Joe Gabbins, who organise it, we don't see ourselves as festival organisers. It's a lot of work, and I don't think we can keep doing that forever. But I think change is the key. I think lyric in itself was different enough to find its place in the calendar of festivals and readings, both in Sheffield and nationally. And I think it's got to keep changing. So I hope we can build on what lyric's been over these last 3 or 4 years, and the sort of the good feeling for it in Sheffield. I hope it can develop into something else, and I want that something else to be about finding new talent and publishing new talent. We haven't quite figured out how to do it yet, so it's sort of watch this space really. Well, I had one of those light bulb moments at school, so I think I would have been about 14 or 15, and we started reading Ted Hughes. And I was a very sleepy student up to that point, and I just woke up as I was reading those poems. I just didn't realise the world was such an interesting place, and I certainly didn't realise that you could contain or describe it in these short blocks of language. It seemed, miraculous or magical. And I think poetry, when it's working, still feels like that to me. Just this arrangement of black shapes on a white page. And if you put them in the right order, you can make something astonishing happen in somebody else's mind, thousands of miles away, across hundreds of years and in complete silence. And I think I still go back to those experiences at school, wanted to try and replicate that sensation. And I think I always knew from that point on that I wanted to be involved with poetry. I don't know if I necessarily knew that I wanted to write it, but I wanted to be part of its readership. I wanted to, I don't know, it seemed like a marginal activity, and that appealed to me. I've always done the opposite thing, like I was the goalkeeper, I was the wicket keeper, I was always, looking for not the mainstream thing. And I think as soon as I saw it, I recognised that poetry could offer that. And so even through my undergraduate degree, which was in geography, I was reading poetry and buying poetry books all the time. My feeling is that if I knew where poems came from, I'd go and get a few more. I think it's just a mood, a feeling that you want to express yourself in some way that goes beyond just the spoken and the thought idea. Somehow you want to make something, and I think for me that doesn't really come in subjects or language particularly. I mean, the poems end up having their own content and style, but I think by and large it's just an urge towards self-expression. I've sometimes wondered whether it's to do with wanting to impose a kind of structure or significance on life, which is, as I understand it, ultimately insignificant. And the desire to make patterns and shapes out of language which find a sort of meaning or a resonance in life. But I don't know. I think beyond that, it's just a desire to communicate, even if it's just with yourself. I guess memory and writing about personal experience can be very provocative and exciting at the moment when you encounter the idea for the poem and when you start writing. But I think beyond that, once you're sort of face to face with the page or the screen or however you go about it, you need a certain amount of distance and dispassion. And I think it occurs to all writers at some stage that what you're trying to create is a work of art. You're not just writing a journal or a diary entry. You're trying to create something which will have a significance and a meaning and and be a form of communication with somebody else, and that involves occasionally subverting or suppressing or lying, you know, about things that have happened to you. You're not just trying to tell people what's happened to you in your life. You're trying to make something that has a particular reason for existing, or I am anyway. That's part of my motivation in writing. So I often have that feeling about maybe 2 or 3 drafts into a poem when I suddenly remember, you know, the personal experience isn't the important thing. It's the act of communication. It's at that point where I'll do anything that's needed to make that poem work. And you know, people are often drawn into reading poems because they think they're reading about the author. It's a kind of a tantalization. I think especially poets are very aware of, but it's rarely straight autobiographical truth. I think the editing process boils down to a very careful balancing act between dispassion on one hand and maintaining an interest in the poem on the other hand. And those two things are always, you know, fluctuating. I think it certainly helps to leave a poem alone for a day, a week, a month, and to come back to it, because that way you hope to be able to see it again with the eye of a reader. I mean, that's the real trick. Some kind of ESP, some way of being able to see your work as somebody else would see it. And in fact, quite often get my students to stand up and physically walk around the other side of the table and look back at their poem, just to try and put themselves in a different physical position and imagine what it's like to experience that poem for the first time. Most poems are only read once. In fact, most poems are never read. But most poems are only read once, so you really want to try and make that first impression count. You want to build into it all that strata as well that will make a poem live and make people want to come back to it. But as well as that, you know, when you're editing, you've got to maintain an interest in it yourself. Otherwise, it just becomes an academic exercise. So yeah, it's a tricky one. That I know somebody once said to me, you know, if you're stuck with a poem, go and do the washing up. This was before we had dishwashers. So I don't know. Some other displacement tactic can be useful. Coming back to it fresh. I think as a poet, you've got to devise some kind of contractual understanding with your readers. It may be that you're so precious and so particular about the way you write and what you want to say that in the end you don't care whether there are only 3 people in the entire cosmos looking at this stuff. That's what you want to do, and that's fine. But poetry can encompass that. It can host that kind of work, and you know, I admire and respect some incredibly obscure poets, and I'm glad that poetry can offer that opportunity. What you can't do though is to write in a really, really obscure, difficult, uncompromising way and then start weeping because nobody reads your work. You've got to find a balance between what you want to say and how many people you want to be loved by. I've seen so many poets who are full of integrity and intensity, and they turn up at a reading and there's nobody there. Nobody loves them. Nobody loves their work. There's nothing there to love and get hold of, and that, you know, they all want to be loved in the end. So you have to decide where you where you want to pitch in on that very wide spectrum. I've always seen myself as a communicator, so unless people are reading or listening to my poems, for me that's failure. I'm not operating, I'm not even participating. That doesn't bother other kinds of writers as much. It would bother me. I think you can go too far the other way as well, where you can make so many compromises and end up being so easy on the eye or the ear that when it comes down to the substance of the poem, there's virtually nothing there, and there's certainly nothing that will last. But it's a personal choice. I think the development in my writing has been a very, very gradual thing. I've been writing lyric, loosely structured poems for the best part of 25 years. I'm not really the person to ask. I think it would take an outside eye to register some of those differences and those movements. But the big change came with my translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which was a completely different way of writing. Very, very formal. There's an original there which had to be followed, and full of all these technical requirements. And that was, the best part of 3 years' work, really. And by the time I'd finished that, I think I'd just got to a point where I didn't want to write poetry that had any rules at all. I wanted to be going down the motorway at 90 miles an hour and put it into reverse and just see what came flying out with a gearbox. And that's when I wrote Seeing Stars. And I think it was a kind of release from some of those strictures and the sort of the regulation of translating that medieval poetry. And those poems in Seeing Stars, they're not like anything that I've written before. Even physically, they don't look the same. They're very, very different. And it was just something that I needed to get off my chest. And actually, since I published Seeing Stars, I've just gone back to my old way of writing now. But yeah, I wanted a madcap moment where I just wanted to follow the expression and the phrase and to see where it went, and to play and to revel in ideas, and not to start be counting syllables all the time and looking for little half rhymes. Just to splurge. And the model for that was James Tate, an American poet, James Tate. He has a book, Return to the City of the White Donkey, and I realised when I was a couple of poems into that book that I was following his lead. In fact, I name check him in one of the poems. So there's an element of homage, I think. But I'm over it now. I'm over it. Well, in 2014, I'm publishing a new selected poems. The old selected poems is, I think, 10 or maybe 12 years old now. So I just thought it was time to reassess what had gone on and slightly regroup before the next phase. The book of poems that will follow that will be called The Unaccompanied. And I don't know, I suppose the title suggests there's a lot of poems about sort of going solo, solitude, distance, again, existing outside a kind of mainstream, but they look like my early poems. There's a lot of quatrains that, from about 5 yards away, they probably look like an old hymn sheet. In fact, I sometimes wonder if that was the real template for my writing, the hymn sheets that we used to have at school. Yeah, and they're kind of family poems, a lot of poems about my parents, a lot of poems about this part of the world, but that's been a constant, really. But that book's still taking shape, so it's hard to be absolutely confident about, what it is and what it means. I think it still remains true that the best advice that you can give anybody is to read. I mean, it sounds an odd thing to say. It should be obvious. It's not always obvious to everybody. I usually try and encourage people to find 5 or 6 gods, people whose work they know intimately and whose work they can quote and whose style and techniques they absorb, and they become part of their own way of constructing poems. I think everybody to a certain degree copies other writers, but if you're good at it, what happens is somebody else's style and your own style sort of blend together to produce something new, a kind of hybrid poetry. I think that it's a good thing to try and find a community of other people who are interested in the same thing, whether that's a writer's workshop or an MA course. I think if you're going to do an MA course, you should probably come to the University of Sheffield. That would make a lot of sense. Just to be with other people whose passions and interests you can enjoy and whose support will be very useful. It's a kind of access, really. It's hard to do this on your own, I think, from a position of sort of being nobody and nowhere. It's hard. So yeah, I think getting together with other people. There's a whole world of poetry out there on the internet now that I don't really know about. I mean, it's like a dog whistle to me. I can't hear it, but it's all going on at that level, and I'm sure there's tons of stuff that you can get involved with, from the comfort of your own back bedroom. I've always thought of poetry, even though it's a contradiction, as a face-to-face thing. It's good to be around other poets and to share their enthusiasms. Somebody whose spell you can fall under is very useful as well. I think that's why it's good to be in a workshop or on a course. Even if you ditch them later, just somebody whose word you can trust and follow for a few years.